the 19th century, Europe witnessed an amazing transformation in the political and economic life. During the first decade of the century, almost all of Europe was under the power of French ruler, Napoleon Bonaparte, or other members of his family who controlled the outer regions of the empire. By 1914, all the European powers had elected a lower house of parliament, and the majority of the adult male population was not taken into consideration. The press was relatively free, and citizens could form parties and pursue groups. Nonetheless, in Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Russia, ministers answered the monarchy rated that the parliament majority and the military shares were not subordinate to the civil statement. Also, as international tension increases, public opinion became worldless and more moderate and progressive tendencies being offset by nationalism and militarism. Europe's Socialist Party opposed war of conquest and aggression but were willing to endorse a war fought for just cause and in self-defense, which in 1914 all the governments will claim to be fighting. After the Napoleonic Wars happened to 1803 to 1815, the Congress of Vienna took place. The objective of the Congress was to provide a long-term peace plan for Europe by setting critical issues arising from the French Revolution, wars, and the Napoleonic Wars. It established to restore all boundaries but to reside the main powers so they could balance each other off and remain at peace.
In France, in the 19th century, the revolution has just taken place. The result is sought to instill. Democracy did not have a smooth inception or development, either suffering from several long and enduring birth pangs. The Great Revolution had turned out to be no more than an isolated, standalone event, the rule of Louis Philippe till 1848. It took another revolution to bring down his regime, this time in 1848. The Franco-Prussian War, to be followed by yet another republic, the third.
Confederation, German people united as a nation for the first time, led by Otto von Bismarck. Germany had only been united, resulting in the realization of a long-lasting and cherished dream of a German nation. This did not in any way mean that a democracy had been put in place. The German Empire was a federation of sovereign states, its constitution created by a treaty among the hereditary rulers of those states. The nation had towards the back end of the century was limited to social democracy, in which it was confined to labor unions.
Also in this century, England saw the end of the power and influence of one of the greatest nemesis it ever saw, Napoleon. Also in this century, the Industrial Revolution took some big chances, but the greatest priority at that time was a set of policies that gave the country social solidity and some element of peace with the high rates of population growth and their attendant problems such as high infant mortality being great priorities during the early part of the 19th century.
Europe went through the Industrial Revolution and underdevelopment to modernization. The development of modern Europe between the 1780s and the 1849 was the unprecedented economic transformation that embraced the first stage of the Great Industrial Revolution and still more general expansion of commercial activity. Major economic change was supported by Western Europe's tremendous population growth during the late 18th century, extending well into the 19th century itself.
Britain experienced an isolated process of economic change that transformed a largely agrarian economy into the world's first industrial economy. The changes were all embracing and permanent throughout many areas of Britain, especially in the developing cities. Scientific advances and technological innovations brought growth in agricultural and industrial production, economic expansion, and change in living conditions, while at the same time there was a new sense of national identity and civic pride. The most dramatic changes were witnessed in rural areas, where the provincial landscape often became urban and industrialized, following advances in agricultural industry and shipping. Wealth accumulated in the regions and there was soon a need for country banking.
The economy of France in the 18th and the 19th century was problematical. France was a major power, but not because of the degree of her development. The Industrial Revolution was the period during the 18th and the 19th century when Europe changed from agrarian, handicraft economies to those dominated by industry and machine manufacture, which made France a world power. Industrialization began promisingly at the end of the 18th century, as it did in Britain. Unlike Britain and the rest of Europe, however, France failed to maintain the momentum of its early industrial start and was still primarily an agricultural nation at the end of the 19th century. France now ranks amongst the world's most economically advanced nations. However, its sluggishness in moving from agrarian to industrial modes of production, together with several other factors such as a declining population, left France behind in an industrializing role in the 20th century. As this process continued, and due in part to nationalist sentiment, France largely closed its doors to foreign competition in order to protect its own industry.
The Industrial Revolution began about a century later in Germany than indeed in England. Germany did not exist as a political unit until the later part of the 19th century. First came the Zollverein in 1833, that, by abolishing tolls between the various German principalities, made Germany into a common market. For a period of decades until about 1860s, there were attempts at imitating in Germany the industrialization that had taken place elsewhere in Europe. This imitation was only moderately successful. In 1870, the modern German nation was created, and thereafter major industries were founded that led to the full-fledged industrialization of Germany.
People needed to innovate the way they got money. This pressure occurred in a society already adapted to market transition, possessing an active market class, and blessed with considerable capital and access to overseas market as a result of existing dominance in world trade. Thanks to this, for example, trade with Africa and America could not take place. Also, the industrialization helped because nations, for example, as France, Britain, and Germany became stronger.
The Prussian War was a war fought between the Austrian Empire and its German allies, and Prussia with its German allies that resulted in Prussian dominance in Germany. The rivalry between Prussia and Austria for supremacy within the German Confederation was at its height. Italy, which wanted to regain Venetia from Austria, concluded a military alliance with Prussia, while Austria formed alliances within the southern German states, which feared the supremacy of Prussia. War broke out in June 1866. Austria lost the war, and this ended in the unification of Germany. After the Italian unification, this is the third independence war. The Austro-Prussian War was caused by ongoing tensions between Great Britain and France, as well as the Russian and Austrian fears of Prussia's growing power in Europe, and it resulted in further colonial supremacy for Great Britain and widespread acknowledgement of Prussia as a major European power. The consequences of the Austro-Prussian War were most momentous. After a long period, Austria was driven out of Germany. The era of Austrian domination ended, and the era of the rise of Prussia was to begin. Some new territories were incorporated in the Kingdom of Prussia. Austria had to give Venetia to Italy. On the other hand, the defeat of Austria in the Battle of Sadowa was a great setback to Napoleon III. He lost friendship for such big countries like Austria.
During the years leading up to the Crimean War, France, Russia, and Britain were all competing for influence in the Middle East, particularly with Turkey. Religious differences were an important factor that led to the Crimean War. Control of access to religious sites in the Holy Land had been a cause of tension between Catholic France and Orthodox Russia. For a few years, and in 1853, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire, a conflict came to a head with a commotion in Bethlehem, which was ruled by Turkey. The British and French responded quickly to the attacks against the Ottoman Empire, and in March of 1854, they declared war on Russia, expecting with their naval supremacy a quick victory. This became true, and in short, Russia gave in, and there began a move towards pistols. The Treaty of Paris was signed on the March of 1856. Russia lost their dominance in the Balkans and agreed to respect the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. In some ways, Austria was the biggest loser. The Crimean War represented the end of the concert of Europe, and that cooperation between the European powers was to be replaced with hostility and aggression towards each other. This introduced every nation for itself feeling, and the indication that in the future to come the nationalist view would be potentially dangerous in the future for Europe.
In Western Europe, economic change produced massive social consequences during the first half of the 19th century. Basic aspects of daily life changed, and work was increasingly redefined. The intensity of change varied, of course, but some of the pressure were extended. New economic opportunity during the time helped the boost life expectancy and quality of life. They also reinforced the class debate that had existed in Europe for centuries. Previously, Europe was controlled by landholders who gained the status through family lineage. This upper class saved during the early period, and people from this class were wealthy and rich. One positive social result of the Industrial Revolution was the development of skilled labor, which led to the rise of middle class. The middle class consists of experts in industrial technologies, doctors, engineers, and lawyers. It also includes people who work at teaching, governess, clerk, and other white collar workers who were not paid as much but still saw a distinction between themselves and the lower classes. Because of the great number of perspectives which can be taken on the subject, it is impossible to form a single all-embracing conception of Europe culture. However, there are core elements which are generally agreed upon as forming the cultural foundation of modern Europe. A common cultural and spiritual heritage derived from Greco-Roman antiquity. The spirit of Christianity, the thought of the Renaissance, and the humanism. The religious history of Europe was particularly complex before Christianity firmly established itself, a process which was ongoing until relatively recent time in some areas. Religion in Europe has a major influence on today's society, art, culture, philosophy, and law. The largest religion in Europe since the 19th century was the Christianity. Each country had its own indigenous religion traditions, sometimes maintained an installation but in more accessible regions absorbing influences introduced by trading and successive waves of invasion.
The 19th century was a century of progress for Europe, in which nationalism was an important factor and cause of the conflicts that took place, and of the modification that European nations suffered. During the century, Europe went through lots of changes, being the economic and political ones the most recent. This century was key in defining Europe's future, because it introduced the every nation for itself feeling and the start of nationalist view. Economy developed greatly and very quickly, which helped the start of the world powers we know nowadays, such as Germany, Russia, or England. Europe faced many problems during this century, but nations found solutions and made treaties for solving them. It was a century in which countries interacted with each other better.